When you think about it, the Resident Evil series is pretty weird. It's taken many forms and functioned in many ways. It's been a single-player game, a local co-op game, an online multiplayer. It's been fixed perspective, third person, first person. It's featured a smorgasbord of weird and wonderful characters come action heroes, zombies of the human and beast kind, and too many mutated men, women, children, and whatever this thing is to keep track of. Yet, through all of that, it's usually operated under the moniker of survival horror, which really begs the question, what does this genre actually represent? Another topic for another day, I suppose. So what happens when you strip back most of the series' flair for the extravagant? Well, maybe not all of them.
Chew on that, you overgrown son of a bitch.
You get the remake of Resident Evil 2. It could easily be considered a time capsule of sorts, not really focused on taking the series in a different and exciting direction, diving headfirst into risks as with Resident Evil 4 or 7, but creating instead a breakfast blend of Resident Evil's good bits from all of its old bits. Where the 2015 high-definition remaster of the original Resident Evil remake stayed largely true to its original vision, offering a more contemporary control layout as an alternative, Resident Evil 2 2019 is all about modernizing. 'Tis a remake more focused on making the game better than you remember, rather than a strict redo. The nature of this is what makes it so enjoyable. The game captures the spirit of what horror was on the PlayStation 1. Slow-paced, heavy on the resource management, dark enough to warrant using a flashlight everywhere, made up of a series of often gross interlinking areas and bizarre puzzles with even stranger logic. But it also fits the mold of what we want from horror in this day and age, from the series at large as well. And I think it's fair to say that at this point in time, most self-proclaimed fans of survival horror want to see more of the old. Slow-burning atmosphere, tension, a handful of slots for your bullets or no bullets at all. I'm looking at you and your EMF visualizer, Ada. Only without the dreaded clunk of yesteryear, something some of us rather like. And this is what Resident Evil 2 largely achieves: old ideas, new polish. The camera, for instance, may no longer be fixed, but its position. It's relatively tight to the character's back and over the shoulder, a style that bolsters aim and therefore gunplay. Combined with these narrow hallways and contained set pieces, it manages to frame the same sorts of surprises in the original game, only in a different way. Now, where the evil within suffered from a camera such as this, by placing it in open spaces as well as cramped ones, and further limiting the view by strimming it with letterboxing, Resident Evil 2 generally captures the essence of the fixed cam, without replicating it directly or placing unfair limits on the player. Essence of the old through a polished present-day lens. Physical settings are transformed as well. Yes, they look gorgeous in the remake, but they're much less eclectic than before, opting instead for a more cohesive space. Something technology now allows for. A more realistic sense of scale, the capacity for smaller lifelike details. How rooms connect minus loading screens, just to name a few. Though loosely, and in some areas directly based on locations from the original, rooms and offices relate to each other in a more authentic way. The same principle goes for the game's puzzles, though still a bit wacky because it makes perfect sense to unlock 3 medallions with rotating image puzzles to get to the parking garage from a series of underground tunnels through a door in a statue, rather than, say, a fire exit. It's far less so when compared to some of the diddies in the original, where once you had to rearrange the shelves in the library using relevant symbols to open a secret compartment behind a painting for a chess piece. In the remake, you have to find the jack to lower a shelf and smoosh them together so you can reach a room across the upper walkway. The chess puzzle and pieces now confined to the sewer area only, and not strewn about every which way. A little bit of the old wackiness, sewn together in a more sensible fashion. Dropping the Tyrant in as a Class A stalker enemy type 2, something I recently spoke about in my video of Remothered, added a fresh mechanical ingredient to a game already dripping in tension, where he played boss in the original, a role that's largely been handed over to the unfortunate William Birkin and his roid experiment gone awry. His main purpose is to keep you on your toes in the quieter moments. That he shows up in what feels like should-be safe areas as well, namely the Raccoon City Police Department's main hall, adds new shocks to the series and oh my god run. Now, where his gameplay function echoes that of the Nemesis in, say, Resident Evil 3, or Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica, and even more recently with the Bakers, as a family of unstoppable, well, tyrants, this kind of enemy type has broadly gained in popularity outside of the series. Whether or not this will still be relevant in another 5 years is anybody's guess, but it's relevant to the current horror landscape now. So not an entirely new addition. The Tyrant is the most visible retrofit, spicing up the old formula with a newer trend. As far as the other enemies are concerned, the game is a little more selective. Though the dogs, undead people, lickers and sewer monstrosities return, giant spiders and the occasional swarm of birds do not. I assume this is to shift the focus onto the more iconic elements of the series. A licker is much more memorable to not just die-hard fans, but others as well. A giant spider? Not so much. One look at those reactive shots though, and you can probably forgive a few creative omissions. Dissolving limbs is probably more interesting than a squashed insect. Anyway, not a new direction per se, but certainly a scaling back of old formulas. And while we're on the subject of series icons, mainline characters have been through so many visual iterations throughout not just the games, but the CGI movies as well. And what we see here in the Resident Evil 2 remake is a renewed, yet relatively traditional interpretation of these characters. And again, this is largely driven by technological advancements. Thanks to 3D photographic technology capable of capturing a model in all his or her glory, a similar tact is being taken with the characters of Devil May Cry 5. These character models are much more lifelike. Perhaps more importantly, they better represent what we might want to see from these characters today. What we find more appealing. Sure, this game is a remake, and therefore the characters we know are much younger here, but these fresh new faces reflect the new generation, or current evolution of the Resident Evil series at large, appealing to potential newcomers, and all whilst giving older fans a healthy dollop of nostalgia with those classically themed outfits. And can I just say, I never grew tired of knowing exactly what Ada's expression was beneath those stupidly large glasses. How the animators managed that, I'll never know. The balance of the series' strengths and weaknesses, traditional elements and newer ones, isn't always as harmonious as Ada Wong's face. Enemy placement was a little unbalanced in spots. This prison sequence, for example, is crowded enough with dozens of undead prisoners crammed into this tight space, only to have the giant slab with legs thrown in as well. One of the few instances I actually felt the Tyrant's new gameplay function to be ill-fitting or misused. There was a noticeable lack of interaction between Leon and Claire, which ties into the awkward second-run versions of the game. Now these are supposed to show the story from the other character's perspective. It follows the same basic flow and structure, opting to simply rearrange the progression puzzles. And while there is one central narrative branch that differs across characters instead of playthroughs, the second run in particular doesn't really marry up with your first, or move in parallel like, say, Ada Wong's Separate Ways DLC in Resident Evil 4. It vaguely references the original game's A and B routes, known as zapping, only without choice options that affect the other character or much crossover interaction at all, outside of maybe 3 short scenes. The second run also results in a true ending, a resolution that deserved a spot at the end of the main campaign. Without it, the game abruptly ends with a smile and hearty, "Made it!" In these instances, of which there are few, the marriage of Resident Evil's past and present feels a little bit rocky, but by no means are these deal breakers. Taken as a whole, the game is a very good adaptation. Fans wanted to see a remake that befitted their respect for the original, and most are satisfied with the result. Those who have never played a Resident Evil game before, but wanted a good old-fashioned survival horror, are also happy. It also serves as a decent boarding point for players that fit into neither category. Where Resident Evil games of the past attempted to reinvent the series and push it forward in bold new directions to success and failure both, Resident Evil 2, as a remake, yes, but also its own interpretation, sidesteps the series by revisiting and upgrading the old, which it does with much polish and little in the way of billowing coats or one-liners. Considering where the series has been throughout the years, the Resident Evil 2 remake is perhaps the most sensible of the lot. A hall monitor, where Code Veronica, Umbrella Chronicles 4 or 6 are the class rebels just doing their own thing, to either your anger or admiration. That said, it isn't groundbreaking in and of itself. It is, more so, however, in the blending of series highlights, strengths, and various other horror lessons learned to create this beautifully packaged homage dressed as a new horror entry. And new horror entries is something the AAA space is sorely lacking. The Evil Within 2 being the last big-budget horror venture that comes to my mind. And though The Last of Us is very much a survival horror game on paper, I rarely see it described as such. So Resident Evil 2's resounding success is good news for the horror genre and the series at large. Especially as an exercise in fine-tuning, rearranging, and streamlining rather than forging new and riskier paths. A stepping stone, if you will, that pleases a broader audience while offending few. It's a well-made remake, but a pretty smart strategic move too. Just how smart, we will see in time. Hello again, and thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this short video on Resident Evil 2. As always, please feel free to leave your thoughts and comments in the section below. I do try to read and respond to as many as I can. Now, without the people on screen right now, this video would not exist, so thank you so much for supporting me over on Patreon. I want to give a special shout out, or a special thanks, to Brandon Smith, Bryson Brody, Chris Cotton, Day Yang, Elian, whose name thankfully I pronounced in the last video correctly, Hampus Dolstedt, whose name I didn't pronounce correctly, I have to apologise profusely for that, Jacob White, Jessica Costello, Marlon, Michael Smith, Michael Rivera, and of course, That's Lemons. Thank you so much for your invaluable support. I'll be seeing you all very soon in my next video. I'm not sure what it will be on yet or when it will drop, but keep your eyes peeled for that. And as always, goodbye for now.